Hello, today I was going to talk about how to install Hadoop inside of Ubuntu, inside of the Windows subsystem for Linux. So first, a little bit of background. The Windows subsystem for Linux is a relatively new addition, 4 or 5 years, and you want to make sure that it's turned on before you can start doing this. So I've talked about this on other sort of conversations, but I'll briefly go over. You go into the features, Windows features, turn on and off, right? Just like I searched for. Scroll down and make sure that Windows subsystem for Linux is enabled. And if not, check it and it'll go through the process. For the stuff we'll be talking about today, probably you don't necessarily have to have the second version WSL2 turned on, although probably not a bad idea. But the idea is that there's been two releases of it. The second release, the most recent release, is definitely more compelling, probably worth doing a little bit of Googling to know how to turn that on. Once you have it up and running, the next step is to install an operating system. In this case, we're going to install Ubuntu 18.04 LTS. LTS is long-term support. This is a reasonable sort of implementation, a reasonable version of Linux to install for this purpose. It's very well supported, lots of information out there. And so basically the process starts by doing just like I did. You navigate inside of Microsoft Store to that particular product and say you want to install it. Once it's installed, your next step is to launch it. Launching it brings up a little command window, and we can close out the store now because we're done with that piece of it. So this is essentially a shell onto that environment. The first thing it makes you do is supply a name. So this is the username. In this case, we'll do my name, and you supply a password as well. So at this point, we actually have a version of Linux running inside of the Windows subsystem. It's essentially being done through some virtualization, but you don't really have to worry about that too much. But it is kind of where you want to install your uh, um, Hadoop installation. The first process that you need to go through whenever you're doing this is to get Java set up right. And you do that by first doing a sudo, which runs the command as a super user, and apt update. And this is basically updating the list of packages that apt knows how to install. Once that completes, the next step is to install a default version of JRE. This is the Java Runtime Edition, and I'm supplying a assume yes parameter, so it basically is not asking me if I really want to waste some disk space doing this installation. Instead, it's just assuming I know what I'm doing, and it says yes, you do want to use the disk space, so it's not prompting me for the confirmation. If you don't include the command, it may be a little more challenging. And for full transparency here, I'm running through a PowerPoint of sorts that I've created for this purpose. It's a little bit crude yet, but it's primarily about making sure I have those commands out there so I know what to do. Otherwise, I might forget something. So once it's installed the default Jerry, the next step is to install this headless Jerry from 8.0. And then you'll need the OpenJDK, OpenJDK-8 JDK, because we need some of the essentially a jar that lets us be able to do a compilation phase. So these are all kind of foundational efforts that are necessary for Hadoop to run, because Hadoop was essentially written in Java. Good and bad. It does make it to where it can run on lots of different environments, but potentially at a bit of a penalty as far as performance goes. So once we've done all this, we're basically going to have Java up and running so that we can then move forward with some additional steps in this process. And so right now we're just kind of wrapping up things loading. And then once this is complete, we'll move on to seeing which version of Java is installed. Your speed will differ depending upon the processor you have, the connection speed to the internet, and various other factors. You can always hit the up arrow after a command to see what was the last thing you did. And here what I'm doing is verifying that I have done the ones that I thought I have. So next thing is to see, well, what version of Java are we running? By default, it's running the 11 version of OpenJDK. OpenJDK is an alternative version to the traditional Oracle implementation that doesn't have some of the nasty sort of licensing issues. So one of the things that it seems to be kind of limited to Ubuntu is by default, normally you can't SSH to localhost, and this is necessary for uh, the Hadoop commands to talk to themselves, essentially, because it's not really intended to be something a person runs on a local machine. It's intended to be running on something you're not actually logged onto, so a different sort of cluster, a set of machines. And so because of that, we've got to get SSH to work locally. The process to do that is to basically, and this is what I found to work the best, is to uninstall it and then to reinstall it. And this is it being the OpenSSH server. And then we go through and create essentially a file that allows us to log on without having to supply a password. And that's what it's doing this. It's creating a key, copying that key over to authorized keys, and then changing the attribute on authorized keys so that it'll work. And at this point, I should be able to start up the SSH server. And if I try that localhost command again, it lets me connect. It's prompting me saying, hey, do you really want to connect to this thing because you don't know it? And I say yes. And then I'm actually, even though it looks like I'm kind of on the same machine, I'm in a different place. So we're back onto our host machine whenever we do this. And by host, I mean the virtual machine on which we're installing Hadoop. It does get a little confusing because you do have kind of like nesting inside of nesting, right? You've got a virtual machine inside of a virtual machine, if you will. So at this point, we've got Java set up well, so we need to basically either download Hadoop, or we can copy it if we have it previously downloaded. So what I'm going to do is copy it from someplace where I've previously downloaded it, which is underneath of Mount C Allen Hadoop and Hadoop 3.3.0.tar.gz, and I'm putting that into my kind of home folder. So now if I do a directory inside of the local folder, it's there. You could do the same thing using wget, and that's actually in the PowerPoint. What I go through is the process of doing that. You go to the Hadoop Apache releases. I'll go ahead and open that up so you can see it. And that is just a website that you navigate through. You find the version that you want to download. You're probably going to do a binary release of 3.3, which is what I selected. Then you're presented with a selection of mirrors, essentially, of where to download it from. It does some sort of random rotation so that you're not always downloading from the same location. Pick one of those, and it actually started the download. I'm going to cancel that because it's quite large and I already have it. Alternatively, what you would be doing is you could copy this link address, go back into the shell, use the command wget, paste in that link address, and hit enter. That would download it to the current directory. Since we've already got it, don't want to spend the time doing it because it does take a bit depending upon your internet speeds. Once you have the file locally, then your next step is to essentially expand it. And that's what this command does here. And I'm not running this under super user because I want to take ownership of those files as I extract it, the directory and files. So basically what this is doing is saying that it's essentially a tar file, so you extract it, it is zipped, and then I want to create myself essentially as the owner and put it into a location that's where I'm at, and that's exactly what this is doing. When you run that command, creates a bunch of files rather quickly inside of the Hadoop file system. It's a little slower if you do this outside of the file system that is inside of this Linux file system. I'm sorry, not Hadoop file system, this Linux file system. One of the nice things that Windows Subsystem for Linux does is it does give you your own file system, but you also, via the mount point, have access to your drives on your computer. So C Allen is a directory that is in my root of my C drive, right? So I'm able to get through it by essentially mounting that drive and traversing it through the mount mechanism. So we've got the Hadoop locally. The next step is to start editing some files to configure it for local use. One of the nice things I like with WSL is that it does have integration within your host environment. So I have Visual Studio Code installed locally inside of my base machine. Whenever I run code, which is the command line that you use to edit a file inside of Visual Studio Code, and give it a file that's actually inside of this Linux file system, whenever I run this, it's smart enough to go down, install a piece of code into Linux itself that allows you to do this kind of communication. Once that's installed, it'll pop open Visual Studio Code inside of my base machine. So I'm not having to use something like Nano or VI or some other Linux editor. I can actually use a richer editor within my host environment. The thing that's nice about that is you get things like color coding, syntax, highlighting, and various other things. So giving it a moment to come up. Normally it works. I'm going to close this and do it again because for some reason it didn't come across just right. And that's how this stuff always goes whenever you do live demos. Oh, the reason it didn't is I'm in the wrong folder. So after you've extracted it, you need to go down inside of that Hadoop folder because the paths, this etc Hadoop core is relative to this location. So you can see here there's a etc, and inside of that Hadoop, and inside of that is a set of configuration files. So if had I saved that other file, it would have essentially created a file in a different location. So here, doing that same thing again, open it up, and it opens up the file that I want to edit. So again, basically all we're doing here is replacing the configuration section with configuration values that are appropriate for setting up what's called a kind of a pseudo cluster of a single machine. Hadoop was never really meant to run on a single computer. So what I'm doing is essentially following a set of instructions out here on Hadoop of how to set up a single node cluster. And Hadoop is not, like I said, really meant to be ran in single node. Instead, it's meant to be ran across a cluster of machines. But what we're doing is setting up a pseudo distributed cluster, and that's what this is here. And so we're working through the series of things here. I'm doing some of this stuff a little bit out of order because we did the passphrases earlier, in part because I found if that goes badly, you want to know it sooner than later. But moving on, so we're back here. I've edited core site, and I can basically close that out and go to, in my little cheat sheet over here, the next thing to edit is HDFS site. And copy this over. And basically what this is saying is we don't really want replication of any of the files that are being stored in the Hadoop distributed file system because it's all, essentially there's only one place for it to go, so there's no point of doing any kind of replication. And then similar, to get MapReduce set up right and making sure to get the capitalization correct. And again, it is exactly the same thing um, that's inside of here down at the bottom part of getting yarn to run on a single node. So this is the map red. So clicked on the wrong thing. Get this up here in the upper right hand corner. And this is the same basic thing that I'm just copying over. So I can take it from here as well, replacing the configuration section with that. And I'm hitting Control S periodically to save it. But you can see though that these two things are essentially the same thing, right? I mean, it's a little bit of spacing issue perhaps, but this is a little clunky through here. But yeah, it's the same stuff. Then moving on, go ahead and closing this to yarn site. And this may seem a bit clunky, but it's something that's done essentially one time. That is, unless you're trying to make a video of how to do this, then you do it lots of times until you get it right. But basically, it's a one-time operation to get your cluster set up right, and you configure things based upon how they need to go. And in this case, we're basically saying what's allowed to run by yarn inside of this environment. So at this point, we've got pretty much everything set up, and making sure I don't forget something. The next step is to go through and start editing our bash environment and setting what are essentially environment variables. So you're probably familiar inside of a DOS prompt. So if you open up a command prompt and you type the word set, it'll show you things like a path, um, which is an environment variable, program files, program data. These are basically things that are set for the system to know how to do stuff. You do have something very similar inside of the Linux world, which is typically in the case of Ubuntu with running the bash shell. Um, inside of the home folder of the user, there is a file called bash.rc, and it's essentially a script that runs whenever somebody logs on. You go to the very end of that, and we put in some things here that are necessary. I've learned that you may need to go through and replace the space after export. For some reason, it's putting something weird in there for me. But basically what this is saying is that Java is located at this location because I want to use Java 8 JDK. The Hadoop home is inside of my root folder. That's what the little tilde is. And then underneath that, there's a folder called Hadoop. And then the path, I'm basically adding the Hadoop home / bin to the path so that the things that are housed inside of that are available to me. And then a couple more settings that are necessary to be able to do some compilation and to know where the configuration folder is inside of Hadoop. So I go ahead and save that. But that didn't take effect yet. So if I were to do something like echo $Hadoop home, it doesn't know what that is yet. So you have to basically kind of evaluate that file, or you could essentially log out and log back in. Much easier to just do the source command, and then now whenever I do echo home, it knows the Hadoop home. Then you have to do something very similar inside of the Hadoop env, so Hadoop environment script. Um, and again, it's just, it needs to know where Java is so that it can go. And you want everything running against the same version of Java. For simplicity, I'm just putting this at the very end of the line. And again, making sure that that space is there, hitting Control S and then closing out the file. So at this point, we've kind of got things pretty close. One more thing we need to do is essentially format the HDFS, essentially kind of get things started and formatted. It's a one-time operation, and basically what that does is go through and gets it ready so that the name node is ready to go. Once we've done that, we can do a start all inside of the sbin folder. So if inside of that Hadoop folder, you take a look at sbin, and there's a series of files in here, both CMD and SH files. If you're running inside of Linux, you only really care about SH. The CMDs is if you were running, helps to get the right slash, if you're running inside of a Windows environment. And so it's possible to get Hadoop to run inside of Windows natively. It's a whole lot easier to get it to run inside of Linux natively. So inside of this environment, there's a start all, which basically starts all the services. I'm going to go ahead and do that, even though I really don't necessarily need them all, but it's just a little simpler to do so. So what this is doing is starting up literally all of Hadoop. And so at this point, if things are right, it should start up, but I can tell I need to take a look here because my uh, home is not quite right, and there's a capital H here. That's my problem. So inside of one of my other settings, this should be a lowercase h. So I need to go and edit my bash settings. Oops, not source it, but edit it. And change this capital Hadoop to a lowercase. And then resource. And then go back and do uh, oops, and I'll take one pause here for a second while it's doing that. And so we can see now that it actually started up, and it's showing us that there's a name node that was started up as local host, and it added my desktop name to the list of known hosts. This allows it to be able to get access to the system. So at this point, we're in pretty good shape. We've got um, the services started, so now it's about making some folders inside of HDFS. Uh, it doesn't create the users folder by it looks like I got a little more work to do, so I'm going to pause while I figure that out, and then I'll resume. So after a bit of investigation, it appears that whenever I formatted the name node, it didn't exactly take. So we're up and running now. So did a few things along the way, but that's the basic thing. So it probably pays to read the screen a tad more than I've been doing. So moving on, what I've done here is created a folder inside of HDFS called user. Underneath of that, I create a folder for myself called Alan. And then we basically, for our MapReduce exercise we're going to do in a moment, you want an input and an output folder. So I'm creating input and creating output. And then to see that we really did this stuff, you can use the equivalent of the ls command against DFS to see there is indeed a folder called Alan, and there is a folder called input. And they're oops, sorry, Alan input. And there's nothing in that just yet. So probably something we want to do here in a moment. So I've got a folder I'm going to copy from. Um, actually, we'll just go there to kind of show the way this works. So I'm going over to a folder called Hadoop inside of my root drive, and there's an examples folder I've created that contains, do a little cleanup here, basically a Java program that is the word count program, the hello world of MapReduce, and then Summer's Day by William Shakespeare. So what I'm going to do is put that Williams or Summer's Day into HDFS so we can count the words that are in it. So to do that, we do HDFS, DFS dash put the local file name, so in this case Summer's Day, and then where we want to put it, and I want to put it inside of the input folder. It knows user and Alan or me, so that's where it's going to end up at. So then now I'll go back to my, actually I'll go ahead and we'll do the compilation here because the Java is here. But to show that it's there, HDFS, DFS, dash LS, and then dash user, slash user. You can see me, then you can see input, sorry, Alan, input, and you'll see Summer's Day. So we did copy the file there, and you can actually do something like this, dash cat, is equivalent of typing it out, Summer's Day.txt, and with any luck it'll print out the file to the screen, and it's doing so from HDFS, not from the local file system. So the next step, we've got the file that we want to process into HDFS, is to actually go through the process of compiling it. So I created the program, copied it literally from the example of doing MapReduce on Hadoop. Let me find that link. So if you do Hadoop 3.3.0 and then MapReduce tutorial, it's and 3.3.0 is the version I've got. And so basically here's the program that we're using. And it's nothing that I wrote per se. It is, however, very well known, and I just lost my browser, which is really fun. But basically, so I take that program, And then the next step is to go through and actually compile it. To do the compilation, because we have a Hadoop in our path, we can actually just issue this command, and it'll go out and compile that Java file into a series of class files. And then the next step is to take those class files and essentially kind of package them up into a jar. This is kind of logically similar to just sticking it into an archive. You could think of it from a code perspective as perhaps maybe linking it, although it's not exactly linking it. But the end result is it created that wc.jar, and that wc contains the class files that we previously compiled together and linked together. So the next step is to actually run it. And so to run it, you basically give it the location of the input, in this case, summersday.txt, the output that I want, which is also has summer's day in it, but it's underscore count. And what it's going to produce is a folder in that output folder that contains basically one file, because what we're doing is uh, essentially compiling or running it through on a single cluster, so everything gets compiled basically to single file. It's not spread across multiple clusters. You could end up with a folder that contains multiple files, a file essentially per node in the cluster, but since there's only one, there's only going to be one. So scrolling back up to see what all happened, we can see the process is going through 100% of the mapping phase, then it goes through the reduce phase, and a lot of other statistics along the way. But what we probably care the most about is taking a look inside of the folder system and take a look here at output. So Allen user output, and now we have summer's day underscore count. That's a folder that I could only spell correctly. And inside of that, there's a single file called part. So if we basically switch this to cat and then put just a star here, it'll type out the counts for us. So what we've done now is just ran a MapReduce program against a text file inside of Hadoop, inside of a single node cluster on inside of Windows Subsystem for Linux. So a lot of words there. The gist of it all is this is a way of doing Linux-oriented development, and in particular, in this case, MapReduce and Hadoop, inside of your Windows environment without having to create a cluster, without having to pay the cost of a cluster. But it's primarily going to be suited for things like education, like learning how to do MapReduce and how to go through the process of configuring Hadoop inside of this environment. So hopefully this has helped. And if you have any questions, do let me know. That's what I'm here for. I look forward to talking with you later.